The town square was already thick with heat and whispers when she stumbled across its boards, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her face pale beneath the harsh sun. Children pointed, women muttered behind gloved hands, men smirked openly as if her very presence were a crime. "She has no kin," someone jeered. "No dowry, no name worth carrying." Another voice cut sharper. "Not even a husband would claim her." Her throat tightened, her hands clutched at the worn edges of her shawl, wishing it could hide her from their eyes. But no cloth could cover the sting of their laughter, the burn of their judgment. She was a ghost in her own town, seen only when they wished to mock her. And then the crowd fell strangely quiet. From the far edge of the square, the Apache chief walked forward. His braids glinted with beads, his eyes were dark as storm clouds. His stride was slow but sure, and every step he took seemed to push the air out of the square. The jeers died on their tongues. Curiosity replaced mockery as he stopped directly before her, so close she could see the lines etched around his eyes. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then he did the unthinkable. He bowed his head low before her, his broad shoulders bent in solemn respect. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, a nervous shuffle, a disbelieving cough. What's he doing? Has he lost his mind? But it did not end there. Behind him, like a tide rolling in, 200 Apache warriors moved as one. They knelt upon the dirt, their faces grave, their silence louder than thunder. The sight struck the square like a physical blow. 200 proud men lowering themselves before the very woman they had all just scorned. Elias Red Feather. I have carried this memory across the years, for in all my wandering I never saw pride humbled so swiftly as that day, when jeers were drowned by the silence of men unafraid to honor. The woman's eyes widened, her breath caught, and her trembling hands rose to her lips. "Why?" she whispered, the word lost in the thick, stunned air. The chief reached into a leather strap across his chest. He drew out a single white feather, its quill wrapped with intricate beadwork. He placed it into her palm, closing her fingers gently around it, as if entrusting her with something heavier than gold, more sacred than life. The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't mockery. It was outrage, spilling like fire. "It's a claim!" someone roared. "He shames us all!" The sheriff shoved through the mob, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "What's the meaning of this?" he barked, his voice straining against the hush that still clung to the kneeling warriors. The woman stared at the feather trembling in her hand. Her tears finally spilled, unchecked, as the weight of 200 bowed heads pressed down upon her heart. And in that moment, though the crowd howled of shame, she felt for the first time in her life what it meant to be truly honored. The silence cracked into pure fury. Voices rose like a storm against the kneeling warriors, who remained as still as the mountains themselves. Women clutched their children to their skirts, as if respect itself were a disease, while men spat into the dirt, their pride wounded more than their tongues could bear. "Stand them up!" someone shouted from the back. "This is blasphemy!" another hissed, his face twisted in disgust. "She isn't worth the dust under their boots." The sheriff raised a hand, trying to corral the noise, his jaw tight with a deep unease. His eyes flicked to the feather in the woman's trembling hand, then to the Apache chief still bowed before her, unmoving as stone. "This can't stand," the sheriff barked, his voice aimed at the chief's bent head. "No Indian makes a claim to a woman here. You've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Then a new voice, thick with menace, cut through the din. The rival farmer, a broad-shouldered man with a face perpetually red from sun and anger, shoved his way to the front, his big fists already curled. "She'll ruin the town's name if you let this stand, Sheriff," he boomed, his eyes locked on her. "Cast her out. Let her follow them if she wants to be shamed." The crowd roared in agreement, each shout stoking another until the square throbbed with a single, angry pulse. The woman clutched the feather tight against her chest, her knuckles white, her breath short and shallow. She felt every eye sear her skin, branding her as something she could not name, an outcast, a traitor, Elias Redfeather. One feather may seem light, yet in the right hand it can tip the scales of a whole town's conscience. To mock it is easy. To face what it reveals is harder still. She turned, desperately searching the edge of the crowd, looking for even a flicker of kinship, a single friendly face. Her gaze found her sister. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. But her sister's expression was cold, her beautiful lips curved in a bitter sneer. "You shame us all," she spat, her voice clear and sharp. "You think a bowed head and a feather make you more than what you are. You are nothing, and now you drag us with you into disgrace." The words cut deeper than any of the crowd's jeers, slicing into old wounds that had never fully healed. Her breath broke into a sob, but before she could crumble, the Apache chief rose at last. He turned his steady gaze upon the mob. "She is honored," he said, his voice deep as distant thunder, "and no tongue can unmake what has been done." The rival farmer snarled, pointing a thick finger at her. "Then let her go with you. We'll not have her here." The sheriff's hand hovered near his revolver again, his face pale and uncertain, caught between defending her and casting her out to the wolves. The woman's knees weakened beneath the weight of 100 condemning voices. And still she clutched the feather, its quill pressing hard against her chest, as though it alone kept her standing. In that fragile, terrifying moment, she knew she had been marked forever. She just did not yet know if it was salvation or ruin. The crowd's fury pressed closer, their jeers rising and falling like a tide, determined to sweep her away. She turned again toward the familiar faces at the edge of the square, hoping, praying for one hand to reach out in mercy. She saw her father, his shoulders stiff, his jaw set in iron. When her eyes met his, he looked away, his gaze sliding past her as if she were a stranger, a ghost he refused to see. The rejection was a cold knife in her heart. Her sister stepped forward instead, her veil shimmering in the harsh light, her beauty sharpened by disdain. "Do you hear them?" she hissed, her voice carrying on the hot air. "You've brought this shame on us all. No dowry could wash this away. No marriage could ever mend it." She took another step, her eyes glinting with a cruel fire. "You've always envied me, and now you've proved it. Marked yourself with their feather like some savage bride." The words struck like blows. The woman staggered, her chest so tight she couldn't breathe. Tears flooded her eyes, blurring the hateful face of her sister. The feather in her hand trembled. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, her voice broken and raw. "I didn't." "Liar," her sister spat, her lips curling into a triumphant snarl. "You wanted their eyes on you. You wanted to steal what was mine. But you are not wanted here. You never were, and you never will be." Elias Redfeather. Betrayal from your own blood cuts deeper than a stranger's knife, for it tells the heart it was never safe, even in its own home. The rival farmer laughed harshly, circling like a wolf that had scented weakness. "There it is," he crowed. "Even her own kin cast her aside. She doesn't belong with us, and she sure as hell doesn't belong with them. She's nothing. Less than nothing." The sheriff finally lifted his hand, his voice hard as iron. "Enough. Take her out of this square. Before dawn she'll be judged properly." A murmur of grim approval rippled through the crowd. Fear, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. With a desperate cry, she pushed past the ring of onlookers, clutching the feather to her chest as though it could shield her from their hatred. Stones followed her. They struck the wooden boards and clattered against the walls. One, sharp-edged, cut her arm as she stumbled down a dusty alley. "Run, shameful one!" someone shouted. "Hide your face!" She pressed on blindly, the alley twisting into shadows, her sobs catching in her throat. Behind her, heavy footsteps echoed, followed by cruel, heavy laughter. She glanced back to see two men peeling away from the crowd, their grins wide and ugly, their intent clear in the growing darkness. Panic surged, pure and primal. Her breath came in ragged gasps. But before she could flee, a shadow moved at the alley's mouth. The Apache chief stood there, broad and immovable, his gaze steady as he barred the men's path. For a long moment, silence gripped the narrow alley, broken only by the rasp of the woman's sobs as she clutched the feather tight, realizing with a jolt that even as her own family cast her aside, he had not turned away. The two men froze at the alley's mouth, their smirks faltering when they met the Apache's unblinking gaze. He said nothing. He didn't have to. He just stood there as if carved from stone, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his knife. His presence was more of a threat than any weapon could ever be. One of the men spat into the dirt, trying to mask his fear with bravado. "Take her then," he sneered. "She's yours now. No white man will touch her again." Their laughter cracked hollow in the shadows before they turned and slunk back toward the square like whipped dogs. The woman sagged against the rough wall, clutching the feather to her chest, her sobs quiet now, but raw with pain and relief. The Apache chief extended his hand. He wasn't forcing, not demanding, only offering. Trembling, she placed her hand in his, and he pulled her gently forward. Together they slipped into the growing night, leaving the jeers and the hatred behind. Elias Red Feather. Sometimes rescue is not thunder nor steel, but a quiet hand leading you away from ruin. They rode out of town before dawn, the sky paling into a bruised gray as the first stars faded. Her body ached from fear and flight. Her eyes were swollen from weeping, but the chief's steady pace on the trail pulled her forward, away from the life that had tried to erase her. The land opened wide around them, red rock cliffs rising on either side as they entered a narrow canyon. Its walls glowed faintly with the first morning light, a corridor carved by time itself, echoing with a silence that felt both sheltering and sacred. He dismounted and led her deeper on foot, guiding her toward a hidden hollow beneath a massive rock overhang. "Here," he said simply, gesturing for her to rest. She sank to the ground, her dress torn and dirty, her hands shaking as she pressed the feather to her lips. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why do you stand for me when even my own father will not?" He crouched before her, his eyes steady, his words deliberate and low. "They mock what they fear. They fear respect. They do not understand that the feather is not a claim. It is a debt." Her eyes widened. "A debt?" "A life," he said simply. "Years ago, a child from my tribe was lost in a blizzard near this town. He would have frozen, but a young girl found him. She wrapped him in her own shawl and kept him warm until our searchers arrived. She asked for nothing. She never spoke of it. But we do not forget." He paused, his gaze intense. "That boy was my son." A memory flickered, so faint she had almost forgotten it. A small, shivering boy, lost in the snow. She had thought it was a dream. She bowed her head, unable to hold his gaze, the feather quivering in her grasp. It was not a brand of shame. It was payment for a life. But before the fragile stillness could settle around them, the sound of hooves echoed faintly through the canyon. She stiffened, raw panic clutching her chest. The Apache turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as the glow of torches flickered against the high canyon walls. Riders had followed, men who carried more hatred than mercy. Their voices bounced across the stone, distorted and menacing. "Find her! Bring her out! She won't hide among them savages!" The woman gasped, pressing her back against the rock, the feather slipping from her nerveless hands and landing in the dust. The Apache chief's expression did not change, but his hand gripped the hilt of his knife, his body coiling with a deadly readiness as the shadows moved closer. And in that moment, the canyon itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether honor or hate would claim her life. The torches glowed brighter against the canyon walls as the riders closed in, their drunken laughter echoing like wolves circling their prey. The woman pressed herself deeper into the rock hollow, her hand scrambling in the dirt to find the feather. She clutched it tight, her heart pounding so hard she feared the very rhythm would give her away. The Apache stepped forward out of the shadows. His frame was outlined by the approaching flames, his shadow stretching long and imposing against the stone. He made no move to hide, no attempt to soften his presence. He wanted them to see him. He wanted them to know he was waiting. The sheriff's voice rang out, sharp and strained above the others. "You can't keep her, Chief. She's town business, and she'll be judged at dawn. If you stand in the way, you'll answer for it." The rival farmer rode closer, the torchlight carving his sneer into a mask of pure hate. "She's cursed," he spat, "and she'll drag your whole people into shame with her. Step aside, or we'll burn her out, and you with her." The woman's breath caught, terror closing her throat like a fist. But she clutched the feather tighter, its sharp quill digging into her palm until she felt the warm sting of blood welling up. Elias, red feather. The frontier had its laws, but they were not written in books. They were carved in choices made beneath firelight, when courage was measured against fear, and a man's soul was laid bare. The Apache chief raised his chin, his voice steady and low, carrying through the canyon. "She is honored. She will not stand trial for the crime of being seen." Murmurs rippled among the riders, unease cracking their bravado. A few of the men shifted in their saddles, their eyes darting nervously into the deep shadows around them. But the sheriff, pushed by the farmer's venom, drew his pistol. Its steel glinted in the flickering light. "You've chosen wrong, Chief. At dawn, she stands before us all. That's the law." The rival farmer smirked, his voice dripping with venom. "Or we take her now. Drag her back and let the town spit on her one last time before she hangs." The woman gasped, clutching the feather so tightly her own blood smeared across the white barbs, a crimson stain spreading in the torchlight. A single, ragged sob tore through the canyon, a sound so full of despair that it froze the riders for a heartbeat. The Apache stepped closer to her, his body shielding hers from their eyes. "If you come for her," he said, his voice like stone breaking, "then you come through me first." Silence fell, absolute and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the torches. The sheriff's pistol wavered, his eyes flicking between the chief's calm defiance and the growing unease in his own men's faces. He was losing control. Finally, he lowered the gun, spitting into the dust. "At dawn," he growled, forcing the words out, "we'll settle this before the whole town." He turned his horse sharply, a clear retreat. The other riders pulled back, their torches retreating down the canyon's mouth, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and the weight of their promise. The woman sagged in relief, but her hands shook, the feather still warm and slick with her blood. And though the mob was gone for now, their promise of judgment hung heavy in the air, darker than the night itself. The first light of dawn spilled pale and cold across the canyon as the Apache guided her back toward town. His silence was a steady presence, his stride unbroken. The woman clutched the feather, its barbs now stiff with her dried blood. Every step closer to the square twisted her stomach into a tighter knot. She thought of the sheriff's promise, of the jeering crowd, of her sister's sneer that still rang in her ears like a death knell. Desperation gnawed at her, whispering that perhaps one place, just one, might still grant her mercy. As they reached the town's edge, the church bells began to toll, a hollow, mournful sound. Their call pulled her like a tether. Breaking from the Apache's side, she hurried to the heavy church doors, her last hope burning in her chest. Her voice cracked as she pushed them open. Inside, the air was cool and dim, smelling of old stone and wax. The altar was draped in white cloth, candles flickering weakly against the shadows. She stumbled forward, dropping to her knees before the priest, who stood near the pulpit. "Please," she begged, thrusting the blood-stained feather out like a desperate offering. "They say I am cursed, that I am shamed, but this was given in honor. A life debt. You know me. You christened me. Please tell them I am not nothing." The priest's eyes flicked to the feather, a look of profound distaste crossing his face. He looked away, his mouth tightening into a hard, unforgiving line. "Child," he said, his voice as cold as the stone floor, "you have brought this upon yourself. You consorted with savages. No blessing can sanctify their heathen tokens. You must repent, renounce what was placed in your hand." Her vision blurred with fresh tears. "Renounce it. But it is all I have left." "Then you have nothing," he cut her off sharply. He reached forward with a swift, cruel motion, snatched the feather from her grasp, and threw it across the floor. It skittered into the shadows near the door. His voice rang harder, echoing against the stone walls. "Go. Do not bring your shame beneath this holy roof again." Elias Red Feather. Many think God's house is built of stone and glass, but I have seen hearts more merciful in the wilderness than in walls where judgment echoes louder than prayer. The woman gasped as the heavy doors slammed shut behind her, the sound like a coffin sealing her fate. She stood in the morning chill, her body trembling, her eyes burning with the betrayal deeper than the crowd's jeers, sharper than her sister's hate. If even the church cast her out, then truly she was nothing. She swayed on her feet, her breath breaking into ragged sobs, ready to collapse into the dust. But a shadow moved at her side. The Apache stooped, lifting the feather from where it had fallen just outside the door. He gently brushed the dust from its blood-stained barbs. He pressed it back into her palm with a quiet reverence, his voice low but firm. "Their walls cannot name your worth. Hold fast." Her fingers closed around it, her tears wetting the quill once more. And when her knees finally buckled, it was his strong arm that caught her before she fell. The Apache led her away from the church, away from the town. They crossed the open prairie until the roofs and the accusing steeple were only specks against the horizon. The land opened wide, dotted with sage and cottonwood, and soon the faint smell of wood smoke and the smoke of distant campfires curled into the clear sky. Her steps faltered as they neared the Apache encampment, a new fear prickling through her bone-deep exhaustion. "They'll see me as an intruder," she whispered, clutching the feather as if it were her only shield against a new wave of judgment. The chief shook his head slowly, his voice calm and certain. "They will see you as one who has been honored." His assurance carried her forward until the camp unfolded around them. Rows of teepees painted with symbols of family and hunts, children darting between fires, women grinding corn, men tending to their horses. At once, the bustle quieted. All eyes turned toward the woman in her torn dress, her face streaked with tears and dust. She bowed her head, shame burning hotter than the midday sun, expecting whispers and cold stares. But the chief raised his hand, and a different kind of silence fell. An elder woman, her braids woven with threads of silver, stepped forward. Her gaze was steady and kind, not pitying. She took the younger woman's hands gently, her weathered fingers brushing over the feather. She spoke in accented but clear words. "This is not shame. This is respect. You carry it now." The woman's throat tightened, her eyes flooding again. "But they call me cursed," she choked out. "They say I am nothing." The elder smiled faintly, her palm pressing over the woman's trembling fingers, warming them. "They mock because they do not understand. Here you are not cursed. Here you are seen." Elias Red Feather. Among the Apache, a gift was not given lightly. To wear a feather like this was to carry a story, to walk with honor stitched into your very being, a mark of courage recognized by an entire people. The women of the camp moved closer, circling her not with judgment, but with gentle hands. One began to comb her tangled hair. Another brought a bowl of cool water to wash the dust and dried tears from her face. The elder herself took the feather and began to carefully braid it into her dark strands of hair. "Now," she whispered, "the story is woven with you. It cannot be taken away." For the first time since the jeers began, the woman lifted her chin. She caught her reflection in a polished bowl of water offered by one of the women. She did not see the plain, unwanted sister mocked by the town. She saw a face framed with dignity, her hair adorned with a symbol that shone brighter than any jewel. Her breath hitched as a single tear fell, not of despair, but of something deeper, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. But as the women hummed a low, welcoming chant and draped a string of cool blue beads across her shoulders, the fragile peace fractured. A shadow slipped from the camp's edge. A man crouched low, his eyes full of the same hate she had seen in the town square. It was one of the farmer's men. She glimpsed him vanish into the tall grass, riding hard toward town. The feather trembled in her hair, and her stomach clenched into a cold knot. Somewhere beyond the horizon, betrayal was already on its way back. The camp grew restless as dusk painted the prairie in strokes of red and gold. Men returned from the hunt with weary eyes, their horses stamping nervously, for word had already begun to spread. A rider sent by the chief had confirmed it. Riders from the town were gathering again, larger and angrier than before. The woman sat near the fire, her hair newly braided with the white feather, the blue beads resting cool against her shoulders. She touched them lightly, as if afraid they might vanish with the next breath. The elder woman placed a warm bowl of stew in her hands. "Eat, child," she whispered. "Strength will be needed." But before she could lift the spoon to her lips, the warning cry went up from the sentries. Riders. The ground began to tremble beneath the drumming of hooves. The horizon flickered with the angry orange glow of torches. The townsmen swept into view, a dark wave against the dying light. The sheriff was at their head, and the rival farmer rode beside him, his sneer lit by the fire he carried. Behind them, the crowd stretched long, a mob hungry to see her dragged back in disgrace. The woman froze, the bowl slipping from her grasp, stew spilling into the dust. The Apache chief rose, stepping forward with calm, deadly purpose. His warriors fell silently into line behind him. 200 strong, they stood like a wall of stone, their eyes fixed on the intruders. The sheriff raised his voice, harsh and commanding over the noise. "We've come for her. She belongs to the town, and she'll stand trial tonight. Hand her over, or we'll take her by force." Murmurs rippled through the warriors, but they did not move, their silence as heavy as a drawn bowstring. The rival farmer leaned from his saddle, his voice dripping poison. "She was nothing before this farce, and she'll be nothing after. You can dress her in feathers and beads, but she'll always be plain, always worthless, a stain on any decent folk." The woman's chest heaved, shame clawing at her throat again. But then the feather in her hair stirred with the evening breeze, a small, steadying touch. Elias Red Feather. The fear of another's honor is sharper than any blade, for it forces men to face what their own cruelty cannot bury. The chief lifted his hand slowly, palm open in a gesture that was anything but surrender. "She is honored," he spoke, his voice rolling across the camp. "She has been seen. Your trial is not law. It is cruelty." His words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment even the flames of the torches seemed to flicker in doubt. But the sheriff's face hardened. He raised his rifle, its barrel glinting in the firelight, and aimed it directly at the chief's chest. "Enough talk. Step aside, or blood will settle this." The woman's breath caught, her heart pounding against her ribs as the torches closed in, their hungry flames reflected in 100 watchful, hate-filled eyes. And in that tense, terrible silence, she finally understood. The moment of judgment had come, and her fate, and the fate of all these people who had shown her kindness, now balanced on the edge of a trigger. The torchlight pressed closer, a red tide threatening to drown the camp in fire. The sheriff's rifle stayed fixed on the Apache chief, but his hand trembled slightly. The weight of 200 silent warriors was bending the very air around him, a pressure heavier than any bullet. The rival farmer sneered, trying to break the tension. He spurred his horse forward until its hooves churned the dust, just inches from the woman's skirts. "Look at her," he barked, his voice unnaturally loud. "A plain face dressed in feathers, and you would make her a queen. She's a disgrace, and you're all fools for bowing to her." His laughter broke sharp and ugly against the night, but it faltered when the chief, ignoring him completely, stepped forward. He did not draw a weapon. He did not speak a threat. He simply bowed again, lowering his head low before her, his braids brushing the earth. A ripple passed through the camp. One by one, the warriors followed. 200 strong, they knelt in the dust, their dark eyes lifted not to the sheriff, not to the farmer, but to her. The woman's knees shook, her breath stuttered, and her hand flew to the feather woven in her hair. It trembled there, glowing faintly in the firelight. The weight of it was suddenly vast, unbearable, and yet it held her up. Elias, red feather. I have seen battles turned not by blade nor bullet, but by a silence too heavy for cruelty to carry. That night, silence bent the town's fury until their rage quivered under its own weakness. The rival farmer's face flushed a dark scarlet. "This is madness," he roared, his voice cracking. "She means nothing. She is nothing." For the first time, his words sounded hollow and desperate, even to his own men. The sheriff shifted uneasily in his saddle, sweat glistening on his brow beneath his hat. His rifle sagged, lowering inch by inch, until it pointed at the dirt instead of the chief's heart. He was defeated, and he knew it. The woman swallowed hard, her body trembling as she stepped forward into the circle of firelight. Every eye, Apache and townsman alike, turned to her. The plain sister, the one who had been mocked and cast aside, now stood alone in the powerful hush of warriors. She raised her hand slowly, not holding the feather, but touching it where it lay woven in her hair. Her voice rose, thin at first, but growing steady. "I may not be beautiful to you. I may not have a dowry or a name you care for, but I am not nothing." Her words carried across the silence, simple and unadorned, yet they struck deeper than any insult, sharper than any blade. The crowd shifted. Shame, hot and unfamiliar, began to creep across faces that had once jeered her. The rival farmer snarled, but his men would not meet his eyes. For the first time, the power was no longer his, and in that breathless space between fire and shadow, the woman realized she had become more than the mockery they had thrown upon her. She had become a symbol, a truth too heavy for their hatred to move. The rival farmer sat rigid in his saddle, his face a mask of disbelief, his fury burning like a torch sputtering out in the wind. The sight before him had left him powerless. 200 warriors knelt in unbroken silence, their heads bowed, their strength made greater in stillness than any weapon could measure. At their center stood the woman, trembling yet unbent, the single white feather glinting like a star in her dark hair. The sheriff lowered his rifle fully now, shoving it back into its scabbard. His eyes darted between the bowed line of warriors and the woman who only a day ago had been called worthless. His jaw clenched, but no order came. The law itself had faltered, broken beneath the weight of what he had witnessed. The rival farmer shouted, his voice ragged with desperation. "She is nothing. You cannot." But the words broke off when he made a final desperate play. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "She is a curse. She is the reason her own mother is dead. She let her die." A gasp went through the crowd. All eyes snapped to the woman, then to her sister, who stood near the back, her beautiful face suddenly pale as bone. The woman's heart stopped. The old, unspoken shame, the secret grief she had carried alone for years. The farmer pressed his advantage, his voice rising to a fever pitch. Ask her. Ask her why she was the only one there when the fever took her mother. Ask her why she did nothing. The woman flinched as if struck. Tears welled, blurring the hateful faces. But before she could speak, before the lie could take root, a wail came from the edge of the crowd. It was her sister. "No," she sobbed, stumbling forward, her veil askew. "No, it wasn't her. It was me." The crowd went utterly silent. The farmer's jaw dropped. "Mother was sick," the sister cried, her words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt. "She begged me for water, but I was afraid, afraid of the fever. I barred her door. I left her. My sister found her in the morning, too late. She never told. She carried my shame. She let you all think she was cursed, so no one would ever know what I did." The truth landed in the silence like a physical blow. The sister collapsed, sobbing, into the dirt. The father stared, his face a ruin of shock and shame. The rival farmer looked as if the ground had been cut from under him, his final weapon turned to dust in his hand. Elias Red Feather. The frontier had little patience for sermons. Yet sometimes the land itself preaches through silence, and a truth, once buried, will rise and demand to be heard. The woman took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat, but her voice now clear and strong. "All my life you told me I was less, plain, unwanted, nothing. But tonight I have been seen. Not as a shadow, not as shame, but as worthy." She lifted her chin, the feather in her hair a beacon in the firelight. For a long heartbeat no one moved. Then one of the townsmen muttered, "Enough. Let it be." Another turned his horse away without a word. The crowd, fractured by the raw, ugly truth, began to scatter, their torches flickering out as they slunk back into the night. The sheriff lingered longest, his face carved from stone. But in the end he too wheeled his horse and retreated in silence. Only the rival farmer remained, shaking with a rage that had nowhere to go, until finally he spat into the dust and fled, utterly alone in his disgrace. Slowly the Apache warriors rose, their silence broken by the soft rustle of movement. The chief stepped to the woman's side, his presence steady, his eyes never leaving hers. He said nothing, for nothing more was needed. She pressed a hand to her heart, feeling the feather in her hair, tears streaming freely now, not of shame, not of sorrow, but of release. And though the night was quiet, it felt as if the whole world had finally bent low before her. Elias Red Feather. And so it was that one bowed head became 200, and a woman once mocked as nothing carried an honor heavier than any crown. I am Elias Red Feather, and I tell it as it was. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support more true stories from the forgotten corners of the past. Now let me ask you this. If you had stood in that square, would you have joined the jeers, or would you have bowed your head in silence with the Apache? Let us know in the comments below.